started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Craig Laubacher.
Hi, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Lori. Today I'm going to be presenting, but I also wanted to introduce a couple other folks who are going to be helping this presentation as well. First of all, Michael Heaps, who is the Manager of Validation Services at IQS Inc. And unfortunately, Michael came down with a severe case of laryngitis. So to back him up, we actually have Tom Brooks, who's going to be explaining some of the success stories and some of the details of the technical side of things a little bit later on in the presentation. So first of all, I just want to go over a little bit what our goals are for this presentation and what we'd like to actually get out of this. One of the other things I wanted to mention before we get started is that we're going to have a couple of survey questions sprinkled throughout this presentation to try to gauge you guys' thoughts and feelings on a couple of key topics that we're going to try to be answering within this presentation as well. Without further ado, let me get started then. So the first goal that we want to try to achieve here is answer the question, first of all, just basically, what does cloud and software as a service, SAS, that's what you're going to see throughout this thing, mean, and can it be validated? Just simply, is it possible? And then the second one here is why the risk-based approach is even more important than before, and then how to handle the biggest risks that come up with this cloud-based validation. And then some basic keys to success. So we try to distill everything down to its core. And then talk about some success stories, where we actually used this model and determined different paths maybe than would have gone on without this model being implemented. So the first main question is, which do we choose? So typically, if you're on this call, you've probably had your hand in or at least worked with two different types of software systems. One, on the right side, is your traditionally hosted software, so it's local software on your local servers. And then the one on the left is a cloud-based software. So just to kind of go through some of the points on this, the cloud-based side, reduced internal IT burden, right? So you're not adding a whole bunch of assets and hardware that your IT group has to manage on a regular basis. They don't have to find space. They don't have to take their time to install it, all those types of things. The second one is immediate worldwide accessibility. So instead of having to do all these installs and configurations and all that stuff on site and then maybe have to add another server on the new site worldwide or a different facility, that type of thing, it's immediately accessible everywhere. And then, typically speaking, it's just a lower capital cost. To get started, it's usually a monthly fee-based type of thing, so cost, actual cash, is spread out through time rather than a major upfront capital cost. Now, what are the positives on the traditional hosted side? I'm going to skip over the first one, right? But the control of your hardware, control of your software, security, all those things really are about how much control and insight you have into the way that it's actually set up, organized, run, and controlled long term. And the top one there is, well, typically speaking, it's just able to be validated, right? So that's why we've used that traditional software compared to the cloud-based system a lot of times. And typically speaking, it has kind of tilted the balance over to that. What we're going to go through today is to talk about how we can maybe tip the balance the other way and add that ability to validate the software as a service as well. So this is our first survey question here, and you're going to see the survey question pop up on your screen. So just a very basic question. In your opinion, in your experience, can software as a service hosted in the cloud be validated? So no way, yes, not a problem at all, or I hope so, and that's why I'm here. So what we're going to do is wait just a few seconds here and go over the answers a little bit. So I'll give you about 5 more seconds. Wonderful. So it doesn't look like anybody says no way. It appears that most of you guys would sure hope to think so, and that's why you're here. So that's kind of the answer I was hoping to hear, right? Because it would be sad if everybody was didn't think it was possible. That's an uphill battle, right? So, all right, so we're going to move on here then to what is the cloud and what is software as a service. I'm not going to spend a ton of time digging into the technical details during this presentation because this is more about how we apply some of the principles of risk management and validation. The technical side would be another conversation altogether. But you guys can read this. NIST has this cloud computing definition of a model of enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing services by resources. So basically, any computing not done on site is considered cloud computing, right? And then some of the principles of cloud computing, storage and computing externally controlled, physical security handled remotely, software upgrades are automatically pushed, functionality controlled by a vendor, right? So those are some of the maybe pain points for life science folks when discussing cloud-based computing. Now, last time we did this webinar, we went through a very detailed look into this process, the risk-based approach. I'm not going to go into all the details again. If you want, after this and want to take a further look, we have the webinar up for free on our website. You can download it and take a look at it if that interests you. But I'm just going to go over the three main points here of this process and why it's important for this cloud-based process as well. So first thing that we do is we develop a detailed process map. Remember, we don't start with the software. We start with the process that the software has impact on. So in essence, we look at the entire software, or the entire process from start to finish, and then line out and highlight where the software is touched, where the software actually has impact to that process from start to finish. So then what we do is then analyze those touch points in a risk assessment, in a very formalized, you can use whatever tool you want, but we typically use the FMEA tool. So then you rank these risks and ensure that these risk rankings are low enough to protect your data so you have record integrity. And then you identify all the mitigations that help control those risks, be it software, functionality, or physical security, or whatever the case may be. And then you ensure the effectiveness of each requirement by testing them, right? So it's a fully traceable model. You're analyzing all the potential risks in that model. So I just wanted to give a simple overview of this particular piece again, because I'm going to be talking about some specific areas within it here shortly. So what are the differences in approach between traditional software as a service? Well, traditional, like I just said, we map out the process, we analyze touch points in a risk assessment, and then we challenge each requirement. Simple, right? Well, in the software as a service, we map out the process, we analyze them all in the risk assessment, we challenge each requirement. There is no difference in approach, right? So this approach is exactly the same for your traditional as well as your software as a service. Now that being said, what we found out during our analysis, we have identified some new risks. So I'm not necessarily saying that every single time you do one of these risk assessments on a software as a service system, you're going to have exactly the same risk. But in our experience, what I decided to do, instead of showing you a gigantic risk assessment and saying, that's the same whether it's software as a service or whether it's traditional, we try to highlight 4 of the most important and common risks that we've seen every single time we've gone through this process. So just try to make it a little bit simpler on everybody here. So kind of highlighting the differences. Before I get into those, look at the note at the bottom saying, notice that the analysis in challenging a functionality remain the same. So the software functions still need to be analyzed in the exact same method, and you're going to assume very similar risks in your software functionality, whether it's traditional or software as a service. So I'm not going to discuss the functions because there are no differences really there. The 2 main differences, we've categorized them into your data center risk and your software vendor risk. So those are the 2 people, if you will, the 2 outside agencies that now control your destiny a little bit. So from a data center perspective, we've listed two main risks that are associated with that: the hardware security, and then the backups and disaster recovery. Okay, and we'll get into the details of exactly what those mean here shortly. On the software vendor side, you guys could probably already guess these: automatic updates and upgrades. Again, it makes people, life science compliance and validation people, kind of jump out of their seat whenever you hear those words. And then administrative security, and that's kind of a broad topic that shares some similarities with the traditional model, but since it's being controlled elsewhere, we decided to call it out here as well. So, mitigating the risks. Now, and I wanted to add a note under there that says prior to implementation. One of the key takeaways here is that whenever you're doing a traditional validation, oftentimes, if you use a software vendor that knows life science fairly well, you can make it work. You can protect your records. You can ensure quality of your data after you've kind of selected and gone through that process. Maybe you want to do a brief risk assessment on it to ensure that you're selecting something of high quality and that, maybe it complies with Part 11 rules and things. But whenever you're selecting vendors and data centers, that has to be done. This analysis has to be done in advance. You need to mitigate these risks before you buy. That's one of the key takeaways here of this lesson for sure. So let's get into those risks that we just discussed. So the first section, the data center mitigation, the hardware security risk. That's the first one that we highlighted out. And you notice a key here: develop a strong service level agreement. You're going to see that be repeated over and over and over. So just as an aside, a service level agreement is an agreement between the company that is using the software and the company that is performing another task to either host the software or store the data or be the software vendor, right? So it's a legal document that binds both parties to perform certain tasks, okay? So everything that you see here needs to be, potentially needs to be a part of that service level agreement if that's an expectation that you have, okay? So the first one here is define who has physical access to the data server. So we're in the data center. It is really important for them to define, hey, nobody off the street can just go in there and willy-nilly take tours or whatever, right? So defining your physical access is a good place to start. The next one is have some sort of health of your data server tool. So that could be your IT person can be informed when you have more than or less than adequate space remaining, if you have dedicated service, if you have potential breaches in security or lost data or memory overload, or there's all sorts of feedback that you can get from a savvy data server. And then the third one is, and something that gets utilized almost every single time with higher-end data centers, is audit results. So that can either come from you yourself as the end user performing an audit of that system, but since there's so many technical aspects of how they control this, an audit sometimes is a little bit limited in its ability, especially if it's somebody who's not necessarily that technical going and doing the audit. I'm not saying it's not valuable, because it can really add a lot of value, but the second one I have listed here is kind of the agency audit, or in this case, a typical one used to be called SaaS 70, but that has been recently replaced by SSAE 16, which is a detailed audit of their data center security, their backups, their a number of different items that I think third parties perform these on a regular basis. They pay for these audits so that they can supply that information to you and how they handle those, a very important task. So the next one, backups and disaster recovery, is the next thing that we want to talk about. Again, on site, you have total control over that. Not saying that every site does a perfect job of this, but you actually have the ability to instruct your IT folks as to what you think is necessary. So the first one here, obviously, we need consistent backups of data and your software, right? So even if your data center loses something, it needs to be seamless transition time to being active again and being able to access that data. Ability to restore data. So if any data was lost, or if data that you used on site potentially was lost, you need to be able to get it back. And that may come from a number of different archives and things like that, but you always need to be able to restore that data. And then they need some sort of off-site backup, so kind of a redundant site type of thing in case there happens to be something happening with their particular facility. Then they can always use a seamless transition to an off-site location, hopefully not even in the same town type of thing. Okay, so the second step here are software vendor mitigation. So automatic updates and upgrades. And this one is sort of the key to success for a lot of folks, for sure. This agreement needs to specify when updates can be pushed. Now, this is quite a delicate subject sometimes when you're talking with software vendors, and we're going to get into some examples of that communication that we've had in the past. But an agreement that says we need to know when these things are going to be pushed. And the second one that we see right here is just as important. There's some sort of environment, some sort of test environment that you can use that mirrors the production environment so that you can perform testing, you can perform development tasks sometimes, you can perform training. All these things can happen prior to the implementation of the software in a live environment. Quite important and very valuable as well. And the third one here is that you need sufficient time to develop, validate, train prior to implementation. So it's nice if they supply a sandbox to you, but if they supply a sandbox to you and then say, okay, we're updating it tomorrow, and that doesn't give you enough time to develop test scripts or to run your regression analysis on the changes and to go implement training and things like that before it becomes live. Okay, so then the fourth one is administrative security. Again, develop a strong service level agreement. These, again, you'll see these in the traditional model as well as the software as a service, but we thought they were important enough to call out. So user profiles are tied individuals to one or more business roles. So it's really the complexity of individual users with individual accesses and things like that becomes so enormous if you don't tie them to particular business roles. So the software typically needs to be able to allow for that type of organization of user roles. So if that happens, then you can analyze your user roles, make sure that the initiator and the approver aren't the same person, and you can go through that analysis much more easily than if it's just 1,500 different users with all different access. The second one here is definition of rules about password complexity and aging, making sure that it complies with your particular SOPs. Again, this is similar to a traditional installation, but another one that needs to be talked about with the vendor for sure. The third one here is controlled access to the system. This comes in many different shapes and sizes. Really, from an administrator standpoint, who can access and change critical items within the background of the software needs to be controlled to a set level, a set number of people. But sometimes people will have experts be able to log in and make edits behind the scenes type of thing. Well, that all needs to be known up front before choosing a vendor here, because you can really control that nicely if it's on site, but if it can be accessed all over the world, you need to keep a close eye on the administrative side. And then all quality-related system activity be tracked and recorded. Again, you guys all know this with audit trails, but depending on the risk of the record, or if the record is I think Part 11 says that, or the guidance document says that if it's routinely edited in the course of normal business, it's a really good idea to have an audit trail on that particular record, the before and after and time and date stamp of who did it. You just need to make sure that that software system has the ability to do that. Okay, keys to success. So we're going to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty here. Before we do that, let's step into survey question number 2. So after I went through those particular risks, what do you think is the largest risk to these cloud-based systems in a regulated environment? So the first one would be hardware security, backups and disaster recovery, these automatic upgrades and updates, or the lack of control of administrative security. So we'll give you guys just a few seconds here before we close out the poll. Okay, good. So Interestingly, there is no hardware security votes, which is pretty interesting. And I'll get into some of the reasons why I think that is. But then a few of you guys said backups and disaster recovery is the most important. 19% said administrative security, and about 70% said automatic upgrades that get pushed down to you from the software vendor is the biggest risk. And that's really interesting. And one thing that I talk about with folks during the risk assessment is that if you select a vendor that is used to dealing with life sciences from a data center standpoint, they understand the security, the backups, and disaster recovery. They actually, forgive me if there's IT folks on here, but they may actually have more experience and expertise in that particular item than your folks do on site. So that actually may be a reduction in risk in some cases, depending on the expertise of the individuals within that department locally. But you're right, the automatic updates and the administrative security from the software standpoint is something that it's like giving up control, change control, especially long term. I agree with you. I believe that that is where the most thought needs to be in mitigation, for sure. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so our first slide here of keys to success. We just have 5 basic things here that I'm going to go over. The first one is select vendors capable of complying with life science requirements. Right, so this just needs to, and all of you have probably thought this way. We're going to get into some case studies where clients maybe did not follow that rule up front and had to go backwards a little bit before they learned how important that was. But is familiar with the terminology, understanding change control, knowing how important data integrity and security is. All of those things are just absolutely essential to have intelligent conversations with folks when selecting your 2 vendors here. The second one I mentioned a number of times, develop a strong service level agreement with your server partner and your software vendors. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, they just kind of give us this SLA, and they may be much larger of a company than your facility, or it could be vice versa. So it depends on who has control. Well, you do have the control here. If the software vendor does not want to comply with these things, you have the ability to ask why. Is it just too expensive? Is it too time-consuming? Maybe they're just not set up that way. And then if they are willing to do certain things and not other things, analyze those in your risk assessment and try to determine if that mitigation that they're proposing potentially is effective enough to lower that risk to a number that you're happy with. So it's not like these rules need to be, you absolutely have to 100% of the time do this, 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 and this. Now, that's really good guidelines. But as we all know, this is just a process of mitigating and lowering risk to a level that you're comfortable with, right? So that's all making drugs and medical devices is, right? We're just trying to lower the risk to acceptable levels at all times. So you can really become partners with the software vendor and the data center vendor to try to establish rules and guidelines that lower this risk to an acceptable level. And then the next one kind of ties right into it, perform a risk-based approach and fully document the cloud-based and software as a service risks and mitigation. So the agencies, the FDA or whatever agency you're governed under, they understand that everything that you're going to do has a set of risks associated with it. They do not want to come in and you just blow it off saying there is no risk, so they already know everything. They want to see that you are taking control of the situation, that you're not just relying on some third party like, oh, I don't know what they're doing, but they do it a lot. That's just not an acceptable answer. And the most effective way of communicating that you've had those discussions and that you have come to an agreement is to outline those in that risk assessment, to communicate those risks, to outline what the numbers are, to show them very openly, we agree, there are risks in doing this, but there are risks in doing it locally too. But there are risks that are unique to cloud-based computing. Let's go ahead and list them very clearly and just be completely open and honest how we're mitigating those things. Maybe it's doing an audit on a particular set occasion, or maybe it's reviewing data before you type. I don't know what the specific case may be, but this risk-based approach communication is so effective being able to analyze the risks and communicate them to your future self, as well as to the agencies who have some skin in the game here. And then the fifth one here, ensure that your documentation is sufficient and effectively implemented. So this can come in the cases of all your procedures, because you may have to create new procedures in dealing with these software vendors who aren't on site. It's going to be a little different than your typical IT procedures sometimes. Maybe you need to perform a vendor audit on these folks, make sure that they're developing things in a controlled manner, developing their software in a controlled manner with good change control, with internal regression analysis to ensure that the next revision is not going to break features of the old revision, that type of thing. So this all may be new to your facility, but for sure, all these SOPs and mitigations, basically what they are, need to be discussed and effectively implemented prior to your go-live date as well. So I know you've heard my voice a whole lot here in a row, so what I'm going to do is turn it over to Tom to go over some key vendor discussion points. As we said, that's one of the keys to success here, is to have this open dialogue with your vendors. So Tom, go ahead and take this slide away. Tom? Looks like we may have lost Tom. That's all right. So I can go over this this particular slide with us. Not a problem. So the first one is the network needs to be scalable, resilient, and secure, meaning that whatever communication that you have and whatever kind of data center that you have, you need to be able to upgrade it to allow for more users, more data at the drop of a hat, right? It needs to happen. It's either dynamically or statically set up, but it needs to be able to be updated and able to be scaled immediately. Whenever it's traditionally based, you have much more control over it. You can actually see it right in front of you. But like I said, with that agreement with the vendor, as well as the tools that you have to judge health of your particular software vendor or data center vendor, you can definitely get the health of those servers and capacities on a regular basis. Okay, the second one here is top industry certifications, compliance standards. So I just mentioned SSAE 16 and PCI. There's a couple of different examples, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, but that really dig into how the data center is actually controlling their security, their hardware, their backups, their password protection, their biometrics, and all these things. And they basically give an analysis, and it's a really nice communication tool that they can then show their clients, which would be you in this case, to know exactly what's going on. So this SSAE 16, again, don't just go in and rely upon it necessarily. If they, oh yeah, they have SSAE 16 and they're certified, everything's good, but dig into the details of that document, because that can really call out some of the mitigations that are required within your risk assessment. Okay, the third one here is backup and recovery schedules for all aspects of implementation and data to allow quick recovery as a critical system level event makes the host unstable. So again, this is something that needs to be agreed upon beforehand to know how fast and how often these backups can be available once they get implemented. And again, I think part of the tools that they have, that they need to be able to run some of these tests, and that's, again, part of this SSAE 16, is that they need to be able to demonstrate that you can recover from any kind of failure immediately, or what the recovery time will be. And if there's going to be a lag in be able to operate your system, that needs to be immediately and hopefully ahead of time communicated with you due to the results of these tests in the past. The fourth one here is provide and manage segregated development environments for validation and training prior to any software hardware upgrade. Now this one, again, is what we kind of call this a sandbox environment, where it's not a live environment. It's something that we can play with and mess around with a new version or new update, depending on when that's going to come down. But you're able to look at the software that will be implemented ahead of time. And then the fifth one, able to respond to issues when reported with immediate access to all aspects of the implementation, from the front end to the application and to the database component. So again, it's taking control of your own destiny a little bit here you have to be able to communicate with your vendor knowing that you will be able to solve problems that are related to any of the data integrity issues that happen on the back end. So you, again, need to be in good communication with your data center vendor to be able to make sure that you can accomplish a lot of these tasks in the event of some negative aspect. Okay. Now I want to get into some of the success stories that we just have a couple of little success stories here that we're going to go through that basically highlight some of the processes that we undertook in order to try to help certain clients get through certain situations. So Tom, are you back with us?
I think so. Can you hear me?
I can. All right, great. So go ahead and go through this first success story for us.
Thank you, Craig. Yes, this client purchased a cloud-based laboratory information system, the LIMS system. They didn't think about the ramifications of it being a cloud-based system. So when they got in contact with us to validate the software, we started with our risk-based approach by going into a process flow diagram and found out that they weren't using this system at any point at its fullest capacity. In fact, they were using it probably about 10% of its capacity. They were only using it to put in data, and that was it. It's just a repository of data. So we took all this information from the process flow and we put it in the risk assessment. The risk assessment revealed that the highest intolerable risk in all of this had to do with the fact that they couldn't control the automatic pushing of the updates of the software, which kind of correlates with the earlier question that Craig had asked. So we looked at this intolerable risk and we implemented some additional mitigations to reduce this risk. And these mitigations had to do with when they were getting ready to input data into the system, they had to look at the revision of the software that was current and then check that versus what the validated version was. If it was the same, then they were able to keep inputting data. If it wasn't the same, then they had another process to follow that would allow them to look at the changes and make decisions on what needed to be done, perhaps revalidation. Once they got that done and the revisions were the same again, then they were able to start inputting the data. So in this case, this is where the risk-based approach paid off and caught a rather common issue with a cloud-based software system.
Excellent. So as illustrated here, again, it wasn't necessarily the ideal situation, but in working with the client here, so they had to come up with a unique strategy and set of mitigations that would allow them to still be in compliance to a degree that they're comfortable with. Like Tom said, different data has different criticality, right? So not all data is created equal. Certain aspects of your company may really value particular sets of data over other sets of data, but that is part of the analysis of this risk assessment that says, you know what, because this is not necessarily the most critical thing, we're okay with doing something that he says here. Or maybe this isn't even the record, like the actual record. Maybe we have a paper-based system, but this is kind of a backup system or something like that. So that's a really good illustration of kind of a unique strategy of trying to be in compliance even without full cooperation with all the parties involved. That's great. So I appreciate that, Tom. Okay, so this next one here I'll talk about shortly. It's a calibration tracking system that a particular client came to us. So they were about to purchase a cloud-based calibration tracking system when we got contacted to investigate the validatability of the system. And it was a really interesting conversation. So the client, so the end user basically had been saying for years, this is not able to be validated. And the vendor was like, you're right. No, nobody can validate our software. And so, but the actual lab was like, hey, we need to get this calibration tracking system going. Let's go ahead and buy it. And so there wasn't a very good communication in here. And so that's when we got called in and said, okay, let's talk about your software really quick, Mr. Vendor. What do you provide as far as upgrades and updates, and how often do they get released, and do you communicate those prior? And they're like, no, we do not. We're not going to communicate any updates to you. They will be automatically pushed whenever we want them to be. Well, obviously, that was not an answer that was sufficient, so they actually scrapped that purchase and went with another company that did allow at least a set of time before they were going to actually go live with the new update. So they were just not willing to live with that particular risk. It was a very interesting conversation with that software vendor, but again, I consider this a success because the client did not spend a whole boatload of money trying to implement software and validate. I mean, you can do an initial validation of the functionality of the software. That's totally doable still. Even if you don't have change control down the road, you can still implement the software, test the functions, and it can look like it's going to be just fine. But then you get into real trouble down the road when all of a sudden now your functions change. You didn't even know about it. You're using a totally different version, and you haven't done any regression testing or any validation or anything like that over the past who knows how long, right? So this, to me, is a pretty good success story. And it just, again, illustrates the importance of talking to the vendors prior to purchase, because that could have been a major, major loss for them. And then they would have not had enough money to go on with the rest of the validation of the new system if they spent it all buying the old one. So anyway, again, prior to implementation is the key here. Well, great. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do here is kind of recap the goals a little bit, and I want you guys to know I see a whole lot of questions rolling in, and that's fantastic, so I'm going to get to those here momentarily. But just kind of a recap of goals. What does cloud and software as a service mean, and can it be validated? Why the risk-based approach is even more important, and how to handle these biggest risks. So I think that we've gone over every one of those, but what I'd like you to do now is if you have any questions, go ahead and bang them out right now, and go ahead and submit them. And what I'm going to do is just start going through some of these questions that you guys have asked already, and then start pulling in maybe Tom's expertise and myself, and we can answer some of these one by one. Okay, so one of the items was, what are some elements of a strong SLA? And I think that was asked a little bit early in the presentation, but hopefully we will go over some of the details of what that service level agreement looks like, and at least as it focuses on some of the critical aspects of this particular presentation. So if you want examples of strong service level agreements, those are available. Folks can help you develop some of the strategies, but to me, the most important thing is to be able to discuss these SLAs with your vendors prior to implementation. All right, so one of the questions, just an administrative thing, will these slides be available to us down the road? We're going to have this presentation. It's actually being recorded right now in its entirety, and you'll be able to download it for free and watch it whenever you'd like. So you'll be able to see all the slides and see exactly what you want from a definition standpoint and that type of thing. And of course, if you have any questions about some of the details of this, you can always just ask us later on, and we can just try to help you out whatever way you need. Well, all right. So let's look at this. So somebody asked here, are we able to help with vendor audits? So maybe as like a third party, and that's absolutely something that third parties can do for you. A lot of people outsource the vendor audits to other companies. So if this question is asking, are we capable of doing that? Well, of course we are, but there are a lot of folks who can help you out with that as well. So to me, though, you really need to communicate internally with, even if you are going to hire a third party to do these audits, you really need to communicate your needs specific to the quality aspect, which is a little bit unique to what these software vendors and these data center vendors typically supply to anybody, right? Because a lot of these software vendors don't just sell the lifetime. They sell across the board to many different markets. And most, if not all of those markets, have very different rules than we do, or they don't have any rules. So make sure that those requirements get effectively communicated prior to performing the audit. The next one here, does this risk-based approach take a ton of time? That's a really good question. And in our experience, the answer to that is no. To be honest, and like I said, you can go back and look at the risk-based approach webinar we did before, and I'm not going to get into a ton of detail on that, but the actual risk-based, the risk assessment and developing these process maps is a matter of a couple of weeks time frame, right? So we're not talking months or years or anything to do the actual analysis, but the time it saves by bringing everybody together, by communicating exactly what the requirements are, where our weaknesses are, how we're going to address those. I know a lot of times in your facilities, there's sometimes what everybody refers to as silos, right? So people are concentrating on their own thing and maybe rarely get together to discuss these risks, because why would you ever, how would you do that in an organized fashion? A lot of times it's just brainstorming and kind of just a bunch of people complaining about potential looking at. This is a very organized methodology to communicate those risks and answer them one by one. So in our opinion, it actually saves you time to go through this process, to organize your thoughts on the upfront so you're not spending so much time on the back end. Let's see here. What approach would you suggest for hybrid systems? That's an interesting question. So cloud integrated with an in-house software. That's a really good question. So a lot of folks will actually deploy their maybe homegrown software on the cloud. But again, no matter if we're talking about traditional, like that slide that we had at the beginning, whether you're talking about traditional or software as a service, the approach is exactly the same. Now, you may have some different risks in there. Maybe since you're the vendor, you're not going to be pushing upgrades to the cloud. Well, that's pretty obvious. But you're still going to have the data center risk potentially as well. So to me, the approach is exactly the same. Okay, let's see here. So, okay, so in our experience, have we found software vendors to agree to not perform updates, upgrades if I choose to not upgrade? That's a great question. That's probably one of the most important aspects of this communication with your software vendor. Again, I have found, and in my limited knowledge, but we have talked to many, many software vendors about this topic, that we have found not much consistency in that answer. That the amount of variability from vendor to vendor is great, because software vendors, remember, come from many different markets, and maybe they're not willing to bend over backwards for, let's say, one pharmaceutical implementation or installation. But maybe they are very strong in the life science area and will totally prevent any kind of updates, upgrades until, maybe they don't do constant updates. Maybe they'll wait, compile all their updates, just do one every 6 months or one every year, or at least planned in advance so you have time to do your sandboxing. So that is a fantastic question, but there are some vendors that will not help you out at all. And again, you need to weigh the risks of the records that you're going to be storing and calculating and things with what they're able to supply you from a quality perspective. That's a fantastic question. Okay, there's one here that says, can you summarize what a typical validation package should contain for your software as a service products? Absolutely, that's a fantastic question. Now, we typically use the GAMP guidelines, if you will, with the types of documents that are created. There's more than one way to do this, though, so I'm not saying it's the only way. But the method that we really like to see here is, first of all, we'd like to develop a plan that kind of lays out what the expectations of the package are going to be. The next thing that we do, the first major effort that is put in, is the process maps. So the deliverable there is actually going to be like video documents or whatever with swim lanes on them, and that's when we talk about the touch points. So the point of where the software interacts with the process that you're analyzing. Okay, so then those touch points turn into user requirements. So now we have a validation plan, we've got process maps, and then we have user requirements. So basically the main needs of the software, and those would be considered critical since they impact your process. Then we analyze those user requirements within the risk assessment. So that's another document. The risk assessment is an actual physical document that would be part of the package. Then all those mitigations that we just talked about are going to turn into a validation requirement document. So there's another one. And then the last one is your actual IOQs, right? So, or your IOPQs, depending on how your system does it. But your actual test functionality that tests the setup from a data vendor standpoint, as well as from your actual software functionality. And then, of course, you probably have a trace matrix that you throw in there as well. But those are the core pieces of documentation that are required for this type of thing. Again, it looks exactly the same as your traditional one. So you probably would like to have your SLAs as a part of your supporting documentation in this particular one, or maybe the audit that we've talked about in the past, the FSAE 15. So those are other documents that you're going to see as part of your supporting documents that are maybe unique to the software as a service platform. Okay, so I believe those are the ones that I have seen here. Again, if you guys have any additional questions whatsoever, feel free to shoot those over to me. This webinar is obviously just a sample of some of the information that we've gained over the years about how to uniquely identify some of the risks associated with the software as a service. But please, please feel free to shoot us some emails, ask us more detailed questions. We can even have back and forth conversation about, about what would be most applicable in your situation, give you examples of things. All those things are totally available to you to help you out in your situation for sure. So that concludes our presentation today. So again, from Mike Heaps and Tom Brooks, as well as myself, we appreciate your attendance today and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
The organizer has ended this session, and this